Welcome to video number 1 for Chapter 13, The Rise of a Mass Democracy. We'll begin by talking about the corrupt bargain of 1824. The corrupt bargain of 1824 was the last of the old style of elections. James Monroe, who was the last of the Virginia dynasty, completed his second term, and 4 new candidates ran for president in the election of 1824. You had John Quincy Adams from Massachusetts, who was highly intelligent, experienced, and aloof. You had Henry Clay from Kentucky, who was nicknamed the Gallant Harry of the West. He had authored the American System and the Missouri Compromise. And you have William Crawford, who was from Georgia, who was able, but he was also an ailing giant of a man. And then you had Andrew Jackson from Tennessee, who was the gaunt, gutsy hero of the Battle of New Orleans. Out of the 4 candidates, they all professed to be Republicans, because they all had very similar political views during this time period, which is the era of good feelings. So in the results of the campaign, Jackson, who's the war hero, had the strongest personal appeal, especially in the West. He polled as many popular votes as his next 2 rivals combined, but he failed to win a majority of the electoral vote. And so under the 12th Amendment, a deadlock like this must be broken by the House of Representatives. This is an electoral map of the election of 1824, showing all 4 political candidates and showing the electoral vote, where Jackson only wins 38% of the electoral vote, which is a minority, and only 43% of the popular vote, leaving the vote to go to the House of Representatives. The 12th Amendment basically stated that you had to select upon the top 3 candidates. So Clay, as Speaker of the House, was eliminated, and Clay could also throw his vote to whoever he chose because he was Speaker of the House. Crawford, who had had a stroke, was out of the picture. But Clay hated Jackson, who was his arch-rival in the West, and Jackson resented Henry Clay's denunciation of his Florida foray in 1818. So the only candidate left for Henry Clay to support was John Quincy Adams. Clay and Adams were both fervid nationalists and advocates of the American system. Clay met privately with Adams and assured him of his support. So on the day of the vote in 1825, on the first ballot, Adams was elected president. And a few days later, Adams announces that Henry Clay would become Secretary of State. This looked like, certainly, a deal had gone on behind closed doors. As the office, the office of Secretary of State, which Henry Clay had been appointed to, was considered a pathway to the White House. 3 preceding Secretaries of State had become president. And according to Jackson's supporters, Adams had bribed Clay by giving him the post of Secretary of State. Masses of angry common folk denounced what they called the corrupt bargain. So John Quincy Adams enters the White House with a brilliant record in statecraft and especially in foreign affairs, which was what his job was under President Monroe as Secretary of State. He ranks as one of the most successful Secretaries of State, yet one of the least successful presidents. But he was a man of scrupulous honor. He entered the White House under these charges of the corrupt bargain, corruption, and usurpation. Because he had won fewer than 1/3 of the voters, he was the first minority president in history, having very limited popular support. He did not possess many of the usual arts of the politicians, and he scorned those that did. He had achieved high office by commanding respect rather than courting popularity. And he refused to oust efficient office holders to create vacancies for his supporters. He only removed 12 public servants. His nationalist views were basically prevalent in his term during in the White House. Most people at this time were moving away from post-Treaty of Ghent nationalism and more towards states' rights and sectionalism. Adams, however, remained an adamant nationalist. In his first annual message, he urged Congress to fund the construction of roads and canals, supporting the American system. He also renewed Washington's proposal to build a national university and advocated federal support for an astronomical observatory. Public reaction to his proposals were very unfavorable. His land policy antagonized the Westerners, and he attempted to deal fairly with the Cherokees of Georgia, but in the process angered the whites who wanted the Cherokee land. So the 1828 campaign actually began on February 9, 1825, the day of Adams' controversial election in the election of 1824 by the House of Representatives. And basically, Andrew Jackson campaigned beginning that day, and the campaign for the next election continued for 4 years. The United Republicans that had existed from the era of good feeling split at this time into the National Republicans, who supported John Quincy Adams, and the Democratic Republicans, who supported Andrew Jackson. This campaign was marked by many exaggerations and mudslinging, much like the election of 1800. On Election Day, the electorate split on sectional lines. Jackson supporters came from the West and South, and Adams won New England and the Northeast. The Middle states in the Old Northwest were very divided. When the popular vote was converted to the electoral vote in the election of 1828, Andrew Jackson trounced Adams by a vote of 178 to 83. Jackson's win represented the growing importance in the West, and also the fact that most states between the election of 1824 and the election of 1828 had dropped their property requirements, and so many, many more common people who identified with Andrew Jackson were able to vote. In this map, this shows the presidential election of 1828 with electoral votes by state. So clearly you can see that the blue-gray are the states that voted for Andrew Jackson. Definitely the South and the western parts of the United States. And the majority of the Northeast voted for John Quincy Adams, who was the National Republican, who was basically coming from the old Federalist stronghold in New England. And we'll discuss more about the impact of the corrupt bargain and the beginning of Andrew Jackson's first term as president in our classroom discussions.